Coming up on the turn of the century, the Austro-Hungarian Empire desperately needed to update their black powder revolvers. When they looked around, they saw so much potential in the new semi-automatic pistol market. But after trials, they realized it just wasn't there yet, and so they chose a rather unusual but very rugged revolver. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the Austro-Hungarian Model 1898 Rast Gasser. I purdied up some pictures real good for y'all. Let's take a look. At 8 3/4 inches long and weighing in at just over 2 pounds, this revolver kind of is in that middle grade. It's not real small, not real big. But it does chamber the unique 8mm Gasser cartridge and chambers 8 rounds in its cylinder. It loads and unloads from a right side gate. Now those of you familiar with the show will realize that I'm about to set this gun down and talk about someone vaguely loosely related to its development. In this case, we're going to go for the famous name of Leopold Gasser. He was born in 1836 and eventually would have 2 sisters and 2 brothers. Now those 2 brothers are going to be important in the future, so make a little mental note. He was also born to a gunsmith father, although he didn't study under his own father. In those days, it was better off that you go and apprentice elsewhere to bring new knowledge into the family. So he would go to Vienna, and eventually he would end up working for Joseph Schuy. Now, Schuy was known for developing a series of clones of the Beaumont and Adams revolver types. Leopold took a lot away from his work with Schuy, certainly a love of revolvers, and the love of his daughter as well, Leopoldine. Yes, Leopold married Leopoldine, and she'll come up again in a moment, by the way. Now, we don't want to go into too much detail on Leopold's life, because realistically, he did not invent this revolver today, and is only sort of loosely associated with it. It's just that that name Gasser stands out so much, and we kind of needed to know why. And the big root of this is that because Leopold would eventually found his own company that was just Leopold Gasser. Leopold Gasser, the company, not Leopold Gasser, the person. Trust me, this will get confusing if you don't separate the two. So Leopold Gasser, the person, and the company are formed around the idea of this 1870 model revolver, which was adopted by the Austro-Hungarians and really very much favored. This double-action 11mm black powder revolver was frankly massive, and for the time it ranked just under the .45 Colt in terms of raw power. We'll actually be talking about it in more detail in another episode. Needless to say, this revolver would prove to be very popular in Europe. It would be produced in Austria-Hungary, it would be licensed in Belgium, there would be adaptations of it, especially after the patent expired, that would turn up that would be known as the Montenegrin. This thing was known everywhere, and most of them would still be marked Gasser in some form or another. So his name was just famous, all across Europe. Very recognizable. He's a very well-known manufacturer in that time period, which is unfortunate because he didn't live to see any of it. You see, just a year after its adoption, in 1871, he passes away. We actually don't have information of what. I presume an illness or injury, but I can't find a solid recording of it. Anyway, he doesn't get to see his own fame, and instead, his company, Leopold Gasser, the company, not Leopold Gasser, the now dead human being, passes on to his brother Johann, who had been working with him. That's one of the 2 brothers we mentioned earlier. So Johann takes up the reins of the company, and he also takes on the widow eventually, marrying her. Johann proved himself pretty well by growing the company broadly based on the military contracts and civilian sales of his brother's revolver. By the time of his death in 1896, Leopold Gasser was a huge success. At this point, I need to pause things just for a moment. Remember, we are talking about Leopold Gasser, the company run by Johann. We're going to rewind and bring in a totally different person. This is August Rast. Now, he was born in 1846 to impoverished parents and, not a lot of prospects, but he worked hard, he had an ingenious mind, and he applied himself to machine work. He got some experience in both firearm manufacture, small parts, and sewing machines, interestingly enough. He would apply for work at the state arsenal and be turned away, and so he started his own sewing machine company. he actually did quite well at this. He really excelled in the design work, he had a good reputation, and wanting to focus on the factory work itself, he brought in a business partner. This will be Michael Gasser, the third of the Gasser brothers. Now, neither man really had a lot of money, but they were determined. Unfortunately, in 1880, just shortly after merging their concerns, the factory burned down. Still, they worked hard, and they had it back in shape within 6 months, and Michael Gasser proved to be able to sell these machines as fast as, August Rast could build them. And they turned out a good quality product and quickly gained a name, so much so that by their sort of public offering in 1884, they had 400 employees. Around the same time, Austria-Hungary was thrown for a loop by the French Lebel and would begin making rapid and sweeping changes to their rifles in service. We're going to have a whole episode on the Mannlicher 1886 through the 1890 straight pull rifles, but for now, just know this is going on. Because of Rast's experience with manufacturing, small arms parts, his company, Rast Gasser, was invited to produce for the Austro-Hungarian military. Just small rifle parts, things like that. It's not a huge deal, but what it did do is it put him back in touch with military officials, and it put him back in touch with that feeling of wanting to design firearms. And so he became intrinsically involved in the handgun competitions that came about in about 1897. At that time, the Austro-Hungarian military had been experimenting with smaller caliber smokeless powder rounds and finally settled on the 8.2 millimeter Gasser cartridge. This diminutive round favored penetration over knockdown power, likely due to the heavy wool uniforms and coats of the day. It also benefited from being able to provide 2 more shots than the average 6 thanks to its small diameter. The Austrians believed follow-up shots to be more important than single-hit lethality. A fairly modern understanding, really. Now, over at OEWG at Steyr, they were testing 2 identical revolvers with 2 different loading systems. Obviously, this 1898 only has one of those systems, but we can sort of see both. If we look at this French 1892 that we've previously covered. So, if we take a look, we either have the choice of a swing-out cylinder, which we all know to be a very good idea with a simultaneous eject, or they were given the choice of a pure loading gate, open loading gate, thumb one at a time with a ejector rod. Now, when they did a test with 2,000 rounds, they found that, realistically, they were getting a lot of fouling underneath the simultaneous ejector rod spindle, so down in here. Obviously, today we would consider that a very minor concern, but for them, it really introduced the idea of some sort of fault, and they were obsessed with reliability. So, they would dismiss the swing-out cylinder and choose the 1898's ejector rod and gate. I'd probably disagree. Anyway, regardless, these choices go forward. I'm not really sure who was involved when. Paperwork is surprisingly hard to find. Somewhere in all of this, August Rast becomes involved intrinsically. I can't find a patent, I can't find a hard date, except Joschi Schuy, who is a wonderful author and has a book out in the German language on these things, has managed to find a technical drawing signed and dated in 1897 before the trials by August Rast himself, and that details this exact gun, but before adoption. So, let's take a look at what he had gotten done by 1897 at least. We'll start at the beginning, which is taking this thing apart for a moment. So you may be able to see that there's some texture on the back of the trigger guard back here. If not, sorry, but there is. So I just have to sort of depress that and roll it forward. I'll turn it around so you can see what's going to happen next, which is terrific. The whole side plate is hinged at the rear and swings right open. And let's just get this grip out of the way for the sake of seeing. And you'll see pretty straightforward Schmidt-Galland action in there. Actually, let me get this guy out of the way as well. We'll go over this in more detail when we get to the animation, but let's get into some specifics to this gun, which is that it's another Abadie gate loader system. Now, I have to apologize at this point because in the last video, I managed to say Abadie a bunch instead of Abadie. I'm just dyslexic and terrible at other languages. Anyway, when we want to load or unload the gun, we open the gate on the other side, and what you will see... And before I use my big finger, since everybody's complaining that I cover everything, I have picked up, with our Patreon funds, the most advanced and technological of tools, the pokey plastic hand. So you will see, and I still have to look at the monitor, that we have a lug that has turned in front of our nose on the hammer so that when we pull the trigger, the hammer is no longer in play. It gives it a little wiggle, but it's not going to set her off. This means that we can unload and load and index perfectly to the next position without having to worry about shooting ourselves in the foot. Beautiful system. We've seen it on the Bodeo. We're seeing it here again. Unique to this one, though, is that very specific shape in there has prevented the hammer from moving forward or back. It's completely locked in place. Unlike on the Bodeo, where technically I didn't show it, but you could still recock the hammer with the gate open. You just couldn't drop it. Okay, so let's get into some more features. While we're talking about loading and unloading, I have to point out that we have a sort of fold up and then pop around ejector rod. Can you guys see that thing sticking out down there? And I'm gonna have to put my hand back in front, so I'm sorry it's hard to see, but pump, pump. Mae will do this on video for you too. It'll be pretty straightforward. The interesting thing about this, though, is that set down inside of there, and this is sort of rare in handguns, I've only ever really seen it in the Luger otherwise, is that there's actually a tension spring, not a compression coil spring. You'll see it a little bit in the animation, but I'll pop up a photo here too. Alright, let's get into more details on this gun, which is the fact that we do have, in fact, not a hammer mounted firing pin, but a frame-mounted one. It's just floated in there. The hammer is bald-faced. It's just going to smack it. This is actually a great little system because it's easier to replace. It's more linear of a hit. It's very reliable. As a matter of fact, almost a century later, we see this design in high-pressure, revolvers today. So it's actually quite rugged and reliable, and surprising that it doesn't turn up all that often in military handguns. Additionally, we need to take her down to get the cylinder out. To do that, I need to bump off this ejector rod assembly. There's a pin at the front that I will sort of loosen and pull down on, and then I need to drive her off the front that way. That's a little tricky on camera, and it's a little tricky just in general because it takes a fair bit of pressure. Luckily, we sort of have a linear hammer right here. This is spring-loaded and it wants to go forward. So you won't be able to see it clearly in just a second when I do it, but what I'm going to do is pull this guy back and just release him to give it a tap while holding down on this pin to let her off the lug that's set there on the barrel. So tap, 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 and we should have a little motion. Oop, nope, a little bit more. It's tricky to do with you guys watching, so give me 1 second. Okay, there we go. Time lapse, and we're in. So I just yank her off the front. Again, easier done in your own lap than in front of the camera. Open the gate, and the cylinder is free. If we turn, we're going to see that beautiful 8-shot arrangement. Honestly, it's like a gorgeous flower. Now, this basically unchanged design would go into competition in 1897 with a lot of semi-automatic handguns, actually. There really wasn't a focus on revolvers. We're talking about things like the Salvatore Dormis, the Mannlicher, the Krinka, the Schonberger, and more things that I'm terrible at pronouncing. Over the course of the trials, the Austrian Commission had basically focused down to 3 key features. The gun must be carried at the ready. Slides, breech levers, safeties, and more would ruin a chance at defense from a surprise attack. 2, as we said, the lethality of the first strike wasn't favored over the ability to deliver follow-up shots. This does not, however, mean a huge magazine would have had a major advantage. It's just a limit to how many shots are needed when you're just one man of many. 3, absolute reliability. All the features in the world mean nothing if there is no bang every time you pull that trigger. Reading those points, honestly, you'd be surprised that this is 1897, 1898, because they're very modern concerns. Now, the execution might not be perfect. We could argue about using a gate loader over a swing out, especially. I mean, come on, guys. It's not that unreliable. But, small bore, high power, deep penetration with follow-up shots, a higher capacity cylinder. These are smart decisions, and they're decisions we're going to see people make time and time again in military and police roles. Anyway, I should probably reach a stopping point soon here so that we can get a look inside this thing and hand it off to Mae. I will finish up by saying, though, obviously, compared to all those early semi-automatic pistols, this was way more on spot for those 3 points, and it would be officially adopted in 1899, although production would lag behind. Taking a look inside, we're going to have to load this gun up from the Gait, and at this point though we can get a good look at the Abadie system in action. It really does physically block out the hammer and allow us to just pull the trigger through to rotate the cylinder each time. In single action, we thumb the hammer back until it locks, then pull the trigger to fire. Also note that unique frame-mounted firing pin while we're in here and seeing straight through the gun. In double action, the trigger spur engages the nose on the hammer, tipping it back and then releasing it to fire. Operationally, this is a fairly simple and straightforward single and double action Schmidt-Galland revolver. The lower spring powers the hand, and that upper V-spring powers the spur on the hammer, and it also sort of puts some pressure back down on that lower spring. We do have to unload with that ejection rod. Alright, let's get Mae to shoot it.
Alright, let's load up this 8-shot revolver. It takes a bit of work. Phew. Okay, single action first. Now double. Let's slow one of those down. And we'll go ahead and show you how to unload it. Not my best, but not my worst. Your turn, Othais.
You know, it's always sort of satisfying to make Mae go through with a gate loader and an ejector rod. Somehow it's even better when she has to do 2 more rounds, both ways. Alright, so when we left off talking about this gun, we said that it had been adopted officially in 1899. But production kind of lagged behind in that they really weren't set up for the tooling, they really weren't set up for inspection. You're going from an entirely different revolver system to this one. The government's, they're getting too involved in it, and it takes them a while. They drag their feet. In the meantime, people are getting excited about it to the point that the government actually had to put out a memo that's like, they're coming, we're working on the inspection process. So there was clamor for this gun, and it would be well received. But, back up one second, we're going to talk about production, because, remember, August Rast designed this gun, but it would be produced by the government's favorite revolver producer, the factory, Leopold Gasser. Now, remember, Leopold was brother to Michael Gasser of Rast Gasser, but that doesn't mean Rast Gasser is involved yet. Instead, August Rast designed this. Leopold Gasser factory is going to produce it. A factory that was headed by Johann Gasser, the other brother, until about 2 years before this thing's adoption. You see, he passed away, and he left the foreman basically in charge to watch over his non-adult son who would eventually inherit. But he overthought his will to a significant degree. It's a huge body of work. It provides for X and Y. If this, then that. It's beautiful and terrifying at the same time, because essentially what happens is he sets up all these triggers, in which case the company will be dissolved officially, and of course they eventually hit one. So even though Leopold Gasser, the company, is producing the 1898, and they start in 1901, like I said, by 1903, just 2 years into it, they're out of business. They have money, but they're out of business because they're officially dissolved through legal mumbo-jumbo. So most of the company goes away with some of the extended family. We're not really going to talk about that. But the machinery, the tooling, the parts for this 1898 revolver are sold to the sewing machine company Rast Gasser. So now August Rast is actually producing his own designed revolver for the military. So when we look at the 1898s, we'll see the earliest models display the marking for L. Gasser, Leopold Gasser's company. Around the mid-16,000s in the serial numbers, we'll see this change to Rosten Gasser as the machining was moved over. Just as an aside to keep track of the players, Michael Gasser, the last of the Gassers, would actually retire from the factory in 1904 due to health concerns. So now it's just August Rast. Now, these revolvers would serve with Austria-Hungary for quite a while, but, 1907, 1912, there's some semi-automatics bullying their way in. Guns we're going to see later, like the Roth Steyr and the Steyr Hahn. These two pistols were on track to completely replace the 1898, except for the outbreak of World War I, in which case, as we all know, every gun counts. So, production was carried on through the war. As a matter of fact, despite being really dated by that point, and with semi-automatics that really could have displaced it entirely, the Rosten Gasser, that thing is going to have their company up to 700 employees, turning out not only these, but rifle parts and cleaning rods and things like that for the war effort. It's going to be a boom for them. The gun will serve well. It's extremely rugged and reliable, basically unchanged from its initial design before the trials, but it doesn't mean it's perfect. So let's take a closer look at just a couple little updates. The first big change is going to be how this ejector rod assembly is attached to that barrel. So as exciting as it is for you guys to watch this, I'll probably just time-lapse it out real quick because it's a pain in the butt to get off. Alright, there we go. So if you look, we've got a lug and a matching sort of pin that align it on the barrel and lock it in. In the original version of this gun, that lug did not exist. Oh, I'm sorry. That lug did not exist. Instead, we just had a hole in the barrel for it to line up to. Unfortunately, that made it weak to lateral pressure, and so it could get damaged fairly easily. So instead, this lug was added, squared up, and a bigger hole set. It's much nicer this way. The other big change is going to be seen marked on the side of the barrel here, and I know it's too tiny to see there, and it's going to be marked on the cylinder as well. I'll pull it out and show you where. It would be right here and right here, but let's go ahead and get a photo out. You see, in 1915, the steel provider for Rosten Gasser ran out of their usual stock for the barrel and cylinder. Instead, they offered up the more available molybdenum alloy steel. In Austria at the time, this would be called Molybdenlegiertem, which I'm sure I got wrong, but it stands for ML. Now, somewhere along the line, the rumor started that ML stood for production by Manufacture d'Armes Leger. That's untrue. There's also a wild rumor that these guns were chambered in 7.62 Nagant, and also seems to be untrue and unfounded. Ours shot 8mm Gasser just fine. I'll also go ahead and show two civilian variations that were never adopted by the military. The first is Joseph Tambor's grip safety modification. It simply interrupted the hammer unless the grip was held firmly. The second is a swing-out cylinder adaptation from Rosten Gasser. Likely August Rast added again. We're insanely curious to handle one of these as we feel like it would have made a big difference for the Model 1898, so let us know if you have one. I'll also note that the patent for this is dated after the trials, so it's very likely that the August Rast revolver was not the prototype revolver we talked about earlier, set with two different loading systems. Civilian sales aside, for the military, roughly 175,000 of these were produced, which is a big punch, a big effect on Austria-Hungary during the war. They would continue to be produced until 1919, and you'll see them serve on through the 30s into the 40s. They'll have a rear line role in World War II. They don't go anywhere in a hurry, but they're not really all that prominent later on. Also, some sources have said that large numbers were given over to Italy as war reparations, which is why we don't see as many in Austria or Hungary after the war. My only problem with this is I've yet to see any real evidence of them in Italian hands or what was done with them. If you've seen any photos, please let us know. It'd be great to find out where these little guys went after World War I. Anyway, huge success story, very reliable revolver, sort of unfortunate about the loading situation, but otherwise very robust. We like it a lot. I should also point out, just to wrap things up, that August Rast would receive a Medal of Civil Merit for his production capacity during the war and his fine finish on these things. Honestly, you know, this thing's at least 1915, 1916, and it's, you know, right in the war, it should be the roughest of the guns. It's very finely fitted, and it's a beautiful shooter, and we really have a lot of respect for this odd design. Anyway, let's go ahead and get Mae in and give her opinion on how she feels about shooting this gun, though. All right, we've got some Mae, we've got some gun. Let's put them together and see what we get. So, what are your impressions of shooting the Rast Gasser model 1898?
Thank you. The first thing I notice when I'm handed this gun is that while it's not very big, it's certainly got a lot of weight to it, a lot of heft, and you can feel it's all right here in the center of it too, which is great for recoil management. Next, you can see the grip. It's incredibly steep. However, I found this grip very comfortable and easy to get a hold of. My fingers easily fit behind the trigger guard. The grip itself on the backside fits naturally into the crease of my palm. The only extra thing I wish they had done was I wish they'd flared it out a little bit at the bottom. I've said it before on previous revolvers, just to give me a little bit more stability. Next up, we'll talk about the high bore access. It's not great for recoil management, but on this one, with the cartridge being so light, it was fairly manageable. The last thing I want to talk about for ergonomics on this gun is the sights. These rear, V-notch sights back here are really easy and simple to read, in my opinion. So for realignment, I had no problems with this gun.
So at first touch, you know, not quite as archaic as it looks in terms of feel, I guess. Is that what you'd say?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's get into shooting the thing. How was it?
Now, before I get right into the shooting part of it, let's talk about the loading of it. I still have said it before on the Bodeo. I like the Abadie gate loading system. However, it feels a little bit awkward to switch to my non-dom hand. And while it isn't my preferred style, I do prefer the swing out cylinders. I think those are faster. I could still see how someone could learn to quickly use this type of system for loading and unloading. Next off, we'll talk about shooting this gun. The actual single action versus double action, I think, is a good way to go about it. For single action for this gun, you have to cock the hammer, then pull the trigger. For this one, while the hammer is stubby, you can see it's got a nice bend up in it so that I felt while shooting it, I didn't think I was ever going to lose my grip on it. The hammer, while it is heavy, I don't think it's going to snag on anything or catch and pull on it its own. However, it's light enough that I felt I could do it one-handed, easily enough. Double action on this one, the trigger itself is heavy, which I preferred in revolvers. I've said it before. The actual pull-through I thought was smooth all the way, and the break itself I felt was clean. I thought this was a fairly comfortable shooter in my book.
All right, so far, other than loading and unloading, it sounds like we've got a rave review. We know that you have issues with the Abadie. We also know that up to a certain point it was fairly advanced, although by 1898 there's not a lot of excuse for it in this system, I'm sorry to say. But looking past that, we have some good features. We got some good follow-up shots, being an 8-round cylinder, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. When we add it all together, when we get around to the idea, okay, yes, it's heavy. Yes, the loading kind of stinks, but you know, smooth trigger, easy single action, large capacity for a revolver, sort of an anemic cartridge, I'm sorry to say, comparable to 32 ACP.
Yeah.
When we add it all together in the sum total, 1914, 1915, are you comfortable on the battlefield with something like this?
I'd actually give this one a soft no, and that's for two solid reasons. One is the Abadie gate loading system. We've already been through that. No need to get that far into it again. The second reason is the cartridge. Again, we've gone through it. It's Granted, yes, they gave me 2 extra rounds. That was great. 8 rounds total. That's more than some of the semi-autos we've shot for the series so far. However, it's still a light round. It's pretty comparable to 32 ACP. It's just not powerful enough in my book for self-defense. However, I will say that I have off-camera shot some early semi-autos, and they just didn't function well. They kept just having a lot of errors in the field. Whereas this one, it was fairly reliable in my book. So compared to early semi-autos, I would take it. However, by the time World War I rolls around, I just got better options available for me.
Yeah, I'd say context is everything. May I?
Yeah.
All right, like I said, we're not going to argue the Gait. You can all laugh at it and point all you want. It was very silly. However, if you are offered this or a Dormus or like the early Mannlicher, choose this. As fancy as those guns are, and as much as the concepts behind them will go on to sort of revolutionize handguns, at that time, it wasn't worth betting your life on it. So I agree with Mae, although I probably would have a little bit more faith than her in this thing on the front line. I still feel like it's a pretty rugged, reliable, very well fit gun. I'm not as offended by the cartridge because in war I would hopefully not be alone when I have to use it. But I could see where you'd hesitate.
Well, to each their own.
So, with that little disagreement, why don't we wrap this one up? Updates will be after the credits, and we thank you guys for joining us once again.
Thanks, everyone.
Alright, audio only update. Let's get through a couple things. One, you may have noticed in this episode that we started borrowing images from James Julia. I'd like to thank them and tell you guys, if you're collectors, go take a look over there. There's really no commercial partnership here. Just, they had the images laying around and we needed them for the show and they really want to spread the love, so it worked out really well. We are going to be filming 2 MGs this week to add to our roster for episodes. Also, the T-Gewehr episode itself is nearly ready. I'm sort of right in the middle of it. Should be going out in the next 2 weeks. Also, I need to point out that over at the Great War, they have released our collaboration on the rifles of Austro-Hungary. And as a final note, I need to make sure I very specifically thank our patrons. I did a little math on what it's costing us to produce an episode. And basically the whole Patreon amount is going straight into episodes every time, and honestly we're even taking out our pockets a bit, and I was trying to figure out where all that money was coming and going, and I realized, just for an example, our average cost per episode on just research material, books and articles, getting them in through the mail and things like that, over $100, because we are so committed to finding the best possible research. Whenever we decide to do an episode, the first thing I do is a lot of research, not on the firearm, but on what would be the best possible book on the firearm, and then I track that down. So a lot of those are one-off. We sort of consume them as we go. So without you guys over at Patreon, there's just no way we could run the show. We're really not getting anything out of YouTube at the moment. All right, well, that's really it. I am swamped, so I'm going to get back to work making more content for you all. All right, bye.